Welcome to the first Capacity Building Event 2022 on the Food Contact Materials International Regulatory Framework and Food Contact Materials Recycling Regulations and Guidance. This event is organized by the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, G-Force. Welcome to the first Capacity Building Event 2022 on the Food Contact Materials International Regulatory Framework and Food Contact Materials Recycling Regulations and Guidance. This event is organized by the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, G-Force.
Esteemed colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you are around the world. السلام عليكم من دبي بدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة. My name is Samuel Godefroy. I'm a professor of food risk analysis and regulatory policies at Université Laval in Quebec, Canada. And I have the privilege to serve as a president and one of the founding members of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society. It is a pleasure and a privilege for me to welcome you to this webinar series organized by the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, G-Force. Disseminating knowledge related to food regulatory science is one of the objectives of our organization. And as a result, we are starting this series of webinars on various fields of food regulatory science, fields covering risk analysis, including the various components of risk assessment, risk management, communication, regulatory policies, as well as aspects related to food laboratory testing. We are starting this series with two events. A first event that is dedicated today to food contact material, introducing food contact materials, the conditions of their assessment, but also situations of risk management and a regulatory environment surrounding these products. And we are continuing in the same series this week on Thursday at the same time at 2 p.m. UTC+1, where we're going to be looking at aspects related to the management of recycled materials. I hope that this session will be useful to you, or these sessions will be useful to you. And of course, we welcome your input as to the way these webinars are being organized, but also for opportunities of suggestions and opportunities of new topics that might be of interest to the food regulatory science community writ large. Now, before we start the session, if you allow me, I would like actually to say a few words about the Food Regulatory Science Society and G-Force in particular. We have a short presentation that will review G-Force, and I'm just going to ask my colleagues here to share the screen. So in a few words, for those of you who may not have had enough background about the society, I would like to introduce the organization. We are a non-for-profit organization that is currently hosted within the Food Risk Analysis and Regulatory Excellence platform of the Institute of Nutrition and Functional Foods, INAF, at Université Laval in Quebec City, Canada. The idea, in fact, of this organization came about in Dubai, here in the city, in 2019, where a number of scientists, regulators, and former regulators, including myself, identified that we do not have necessarily a society or a home for those various disciplines that we call regulatory science. And that's how essentially we moved from an idea to actually creating the organization that was incorporated in Canada under the Non-for-Profit Corporations Act in December of 2020. Now, the organization is open to all members of the community. In fact, there is no membership fee. So essentially, membership into the organization is free of charge. And there are two categories of members, both regular members who have access to all the resources of the society, as well as affiliated members that tend to be endorsed by existing members and particularly by board members. Now, if we try to define what food regulatory science is, it is essentially the set of disciplines that underpin food regulatory decisions. And because essentially we consider food regulatory science as a component of food science, you wouldn't find it strange that, in fact, G-Force applied to be a disciplinary organization to one of the most well, I would say, known and also regarded organizations in the field, that is the International Union of Food Science and Technology, IOFOST, which is also known to be the global voice for food science and technology. And IOFOST is in fact the only representative for the discipline of food science and technology elected into the International Science Council by its interdisciplinary peers. So G-Force, in fact, serves as a disciplinary organization in the field of food regulatory science. Now, if you would like to know more about our organization, I invite you, in fact, to visit our website, and you will find details about the bylaws, about even the governance structure. And we are striving, in fact, to make the information about the organization available and as transparent, as accessible as it may possibly be. So gforce.org is, in fact, the website that I would direct you to. Now, from here, and after hoping that you have had enough background on the organization, I would like to shift gears and introduce today's event. Today's event is in fact dedicated to food contact material. And food contact materials cover a broad and complex range of products and articles that come in contact with food. Of course, all of us know packaging applications, but the various products that can be used in the kitchen, so essentially cutlery or any products that might be applied in the context of food production and that may come in contact with food, these are all part of the definition of food contact material. These materials are not inert materials and may in fact transfer into the food supply, into foods, with possible repercussions both on the safety and the quality of the products. That is why it's quite important that we assess the suitability of these materials. And while we are waiting, in fact, to have a harmonized framework that will guide us on the way the assessment and the management of these products ought to happen, we have right now around the world a number of practices that look at the regulatory framework and how essentially these products are managed from a regulatory standpoint. This is what we will be focusing our event towards today. And we have, in fact, a program today that is made out of 2 sessions. A first session that will be mostly brought to us by Dr. Sandra Domenech, who will introduce, in fact, the various applications and even hopefully share with you, in fact, the complexity of these products and the way they are used. And then a second session that will focus on the regulatory frameworks or some examples of regulatory frameworks for food contact material and food packaging material. We will have examples coming from Canada, the United States, the European Union, as well as Australia, New Zealand. So I would like, in fact, to start by thanking our speakers who have kindly agreed to use their time and to be with us today for this webinar. As I mentioned, we have the privilege to welcome Professor Sandra Domenech from AgroParisTech. Also to have the contribution of Dr. Amin Kassouf from the Global Food Regulatory Science Society. Also the contribution of Dr. Mark Feely from Canada, as well as Dr. Scott Crerar from Australia. So as you see, we try to bring a diversity of insights as to the way these products are managed. And without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Professor Sandra Domenech from AgroParisTech. Dr. Domenech is the director and the chair of COPAC and has a very demonstrated track record in researching the assessment, the management, but also the analysis of these products. So Dr. Domenech, welcome and thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for this kind introduction. So I'm going to share my screen, if you don't mind. Okay, so first of all, so let me thank also for your very kind invitation, and I'm very happy to start this afternoon now with you and before this very large audience in introducing you into the food contact materials and their interactions with the food. So as was already said, I'm coming from AgroParisTech, who is member of the University Paris-Saclay, which is now the largest university of France. And I'm working in a research unit which is called Safe Food, and this is now also the largest French research unit concerned with food and bioproducts engineering. The idea here is to work on the eco-design production of food products by the mechanistic and dynamic understanding of these complex systems and in taking into account the expectation of users and the sustainability criteria. That's why I'm now also directing this chair, which is a chair of patronage called COPAC. And here I'm working across the whole supply chain in order to make eco-design of food packaging and taking into account all the needs of the different stakeholders of the value chain. And what is more closer to what we are going to speak about today is that I'm also working inside a project which is called SafeMat. And this project is a specific structure concerned with the safe design of food packaging materials. And it is mainly based on the methods of mathematical modeling. So my pleasure is now to take you through the contact materials as a short introduction, and then to give you some background on the interaction between food packaging and show you some challenges, which are mostly challenges now from the European side, which are linked to the place of food packaging in the circular economy. So food packaging is an active partner of the supply chain. As you all know, agricultural products are seasonal and they are mostly produced very far from their consumers, which means that the packaging needs to help transformation and logistics and bring in one point the food product to his consumer, and during this logistic transport ensure its quality and also its safety. And this is then going to be certified also by what you very much know, I think, the used before and the best buy dates. There is a lot of things which can induce food spoilage, which can spoilage by biological aggressors like insects or microorganisms, but also contaminants by particles or other external contaminants, and things like oxygen ingress or water vapor exchange, for example. That's why the food packaging here is here to protect the food from all of these. And then you have these four big functions of the packaging, which you can find in any textbook. We are now the transport of the food, its positioning, the conservation, and the communication. So more precisely, the conservation is then a protection against the mechanical impact, the protection against the microbial, chemical, and physical contamination of the food, but also not to forget the protection of its sensorial and also nutritional quality. Design issues are linked to the communication, presentation, and selling of the food, because it is in fact the packaging which in most cases is going to sell the food, and is also going to inform your consumer on all the legal requirements. And design is also very important for having a packaging which is easy to use by the final client. And today, more and more design is needed also to decrease the ecological footprint, either of the packaging in itself or of what is called the total service offer, which means that this is the product plus the packaging. And basically, this will mean that the packaging needs to ensure decrease of the food losses. To achieve all these functions, a packaging system has developed, which is consisting of the primary packaging. This is the packaging which is in direct contact with the foodstuff. And I wanted to remind you here that you see a bottle, but it is not only the bottle. You have the body of the bottle, but you have also often a label fixed to it. And then you have a closure. And the closure technology are not going to be needed to be neglected, because a lot of quality and also security issues can come, in fact, from the closure. Then often you have not the bottle which is directly sold to your consumer. So the consumer unit is going to read the bottle inside a secondary packaging, which can be a cardboard box. And then this cardboard box can be in the transport in bigger boxes, packed on pallets. And when you make like a mass balance, you can find that those transport boxes in mass, they are more important. So it's more than 50% of the packaging materials are used inside here in the B2B circuit, and only the minor part is used in the B2C circuit. When you look at the market share of different materials, it is easily to be seen here that the plastics are having the biggest market share. So either by themselves, or also I remind you that when you have paper and board or even metal packagings, then there is often a presence of polymer coatings. So polymers are also concerned in this type of packagings. And so not surprisingly, packaging is the main application of the polymers today, and it accounts for almost 40% of their annual production volume. And that's why it is quite important to look on the safety concerns of plastic packaging. So as was already said before, the plastics are not inert with the contact of food. Interactions occur, and those interactions are mostly linked to mass transport. In fact, when we look at the general laws of thermodynamics, we can see that when we have an atmospheric gas composition outside the packaging, which is different from the one which is inside the packaging, for example, for modified atmosphere packaging, then the concentrations will tend to equilibrate, as this is what thermodynamics are going to teach us. This means that there is going to be permeation of gas from outside the packaging into the inside, and the other way around is also true. This means also that when you have a technological adjuvant or a contaminant which is conserved in the plastic, then it can be extracted by the food, and we term this migration when you have those contaminants coming from the plastic inside the food. The other way around is, of course, true also. So you can have a number, mostly volatile molecules, which are contained in the food, and then they can be sorbed by the plastic. And then we are going to term these processes here sorption. Of course, the migration, this is our first concern, and this is a food safety concern, but not to neglect the two other possibilities. Permeation and sorption are often linked with food quality concerns, as they can decrease the aroma intensity, unbalanced flavor of your food, or even have a modifying effect on the packaging in itself. So, of course, let's come back to safety. So I am showing you here in the very scientific point of view this problematic of mass transport. You have a contaminant contained in a polymer, and you have the food in contact of it. Of course, there is going to be equilibration of the concentration, and this is described by the Fick's second law. This law tells us that the diffusion is in our field of application always the rate limiting step, and the diffusion, this is the kinetics, so the rate by which the transport is going to happen, and this is linked to the cohesiveness of the polymer, the size of the micron, and the temperature. But then you have also a second part, which is the partition coefficient, and the partition coefficient, which is termed here, is describing the equilibrium value. This is a convention, so this is describing how much of your contaminant is going to be dissolved in the end of the equilibration process in the food with respect to the part which is remaining inside of the polymer. The fact that it is termed like this means that when the value here is high, then you are on the good side, which means that the contaminant very much likes the polymer and doesn't like the food. So this is good. You have different situations then to manage here. The first situation, which is the best situation for any food safety manager, it is that you have a very slow process, so a low diffusion coefficient and a high partitioning. So it is slow and it doesn't go very thoroughly to the food. So there you have a little contamination. Then you can have a quick process, but still not very high affinity of the contaminant to the food, still an intermediate situation here. And then this shows you here that when the partitioning coefficient is going to be low, which means that your contaminant is liking the food, you have always a problem in managing your safety. And you have this problem when you have slow kinetics. And of course, you have the most concerning situation is going to be a very fast process and a high solubility of the contamination in the food. So these situations need to be evaluated, and this evaluation is on the ground of all the migration testings which are asked for by the different legislations of the world, and which are going to be explained in the presentation after me. So two different possibilities to evaluate. Either you do an experiment where you are going to immerse your strip of your polymer and then measure the concentration of the migrant in the food simulant. You can also use a migration cell and do the same measurement. The difficulty here is linked to the analytical chemistry, because you will need to have very low limits of detection in order to, and very specific materials for analytical devices in order to detect your contaminants. And it is quite time consuming. The legislation does allow also the migration modeling, and this is quite a good news because as I told you before, the physical chemical background is very well known, which means that this can be calculated. The migration can be calculated, and it can be calculated especially when you know the different transport parameters of your system and when the interaction between the polymer and the food is neglectable, which means that your transport is following fixed second law. Here, the difficulty is, of course, the availability of the data of the transport properties. In this respect, we developed inside the SafeMat project a comprehensive tool of migration modeling, which is called FMaker tool, and it is an open source project. You can find it here in this link, and you can copy and work with it. This simulates the migration of any type of surrogate inside a food contact material, taking into account either existing databases of known diffusion coefficients or known partitioning coefficients, or very robust physical extrapolations, of these different transport parameters, always ensuring to have an overestimation, because the overestimation is giving us the assurance that we are on the safe side. Then you have, with this type of calculation, a very high throughput methodology, which can help you to have a lot of results in very short time. And we are able to scale this on a severity and criticality scale, which can then help you also in your decision-making process. Where the issues are is when we have strong interactions between the food and the packaging, which, for example, bring about the morphological changes of the polymer. I give you an example here on PLA, which is getting plasticized by ethyl acetate. So you see the glass transition temperature of the PLA and the quantity of ethyl acetate sorbed inside the polymer, and there is a quite important degrees of this glass transition. And also an increase of the crystallinity of the polymer. This means here the polymer is changing and its transport parameters are changing, which means that it is not described only by the Fickert second law again. And then we need to evaluate in order to be sure to not make an error in prediction, for example, of transport properties. Aroma sculpting can be also a problem. This was ethyl acetate, and it is a very widely used aroma compound. And what is very tricky with the aroma compounds is that they are sorbed always in a synergistic manner, which means that when you have already a compound present in the polymer, it's going to open up new volumes and help the other compounds to be sorbed inside it. And then you can come back to this type of situations of morphological changes. The second challenge I wanted to share with you is the plastics in the circular economy. In Europe, there is a very big policy driver in order to enforce this circular economy by favoring very much the recycling of post-consumer plastic wastes. Ideally, this recycling would be a closed loop recycling with a very, very large number of cycles. This is something which is today accessible for glass bottles, for example, or metal packaging. When you are coming back to paper and board, there is limited recycling. It is quite an important number of cycles which can be done, but this is going to be for infinity. And this limited recycling is even more true for plastics, as in Europe, you have only the PET bottles which can do several cycles, which means that the PET bottles can come and be recycled back to a bottle. All the other food packaging materials are concerned with downcycling, which means that when they are recycled, the second application is not a food contact anymore. The reason of this is, of course, the high contamination risk of plastics in an open post-consumer recycling because of contaminants coming from possible misuses, from cross-contaminations by the collection with non-food contact materials, and from sorting errors. So in the aim to be able to recycle back the plastic to food contact material, the EFSA is imposing specific processes, and you will need to show that you have regeneration and super cleaning technologies which are ensuring food safety over challenge tests. And the challenge tests are also asked for in by the FDA, for example, here, which shows you what you will need to do in order to be sure that your cleaning strategy is then safe for being used by a consumer, for the plastic being used by the consumer's food contact material. From the evaluation and chemical analytical side, this is the, I think, trickiest challenge, because this means that we will need to evaluate always random unknown molecules. So non-targeted analysis of contaminants is a very active research field, and these random unknowns, this means that those are molecules, they are present, but they cannot predict it because they come from casual contamination because of misuse or the presence of a random contaminated object in a waste bin, a random contamination of the polymer processing equipment. So it is quite tricky to evaluate all those. There are confirmed risks for paper and for plastics. And here this slide is only to tell you that we were making the experiment. So just because you put your food inside of a virgin polyethylene pack, you are not on the safe side when you put it inside a recycled food container, as we were showing that this is not a functional barrier. You have almost no retarding of the migration of dangerous substances through the polyethylene inside the food. So in the European regulation, this NIAS problematic needs to be managed for the food contact materials and also for the recycled food contact materials. So in conclusion, I was taking you through the very physical chemical principles of the mass transport, which are the grounds of the safety evaluation of the packaging materials. And so here the good news is that this is almost known and the physics are installed and sure. Therefore, we can use modeling approaches for the evaluation of migration. And those model approaches, they are very valuable add-in where analytical chemistry is going to be very much limited, which means in situation where the risk assessment and the management of unknown substances needs to be done. So we can develop methods for the prediction of exposure to unknown substances, where you ignore your acceptable exposure limits. And this is especially true when you have molecules with endocrine disruption activity, and you need to take into account the cocktail effects. The assessment of migration and exposure below the analytical detection limits is also possible by calculation, and the assessment and design of functional barriers. But besides that, there is also other challenges we will need to raise to all together. It is the traceability of the recycled materials, the containers and the decontamination, the management of the cross-contamination during collection, sorting and recycling, and the analysis of the NIAS through the life of the container or the recycled container, taking into account the aging of the materials. With this, I thank you very much for your attention. And when you like a further reading, I can advise you to look on our online lectures platform on food packaging, and you find the link here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dominic, for this great overview. And I guess from your presentation, we do have a sense of the complexity of these products and the complexity also of the very scientific disciplines that need to intervene for us to be able to assess, manage these applications and even study these applications for their suitability to be used in conjunction with food production. I would like to ask our viewers if they could potentially hold off on questions or comments. For the time being, we will continue with the rest of the program, and we will plan, in fact, a session of questions, answers, and comments at the end of this webinar. So just actually devoting perhaps 20 to 30 minutes to this part. Now, after this great introduction to these applications, no wonder that these products require an oversight from food regulatory authorities, and an oversight, in fact, that is enshrined in food regulations, whether be it technical regulations, guidelines, guidance documents. And so far, we do not have, in fact, an international framework for that. Rather, there are a number of authorities that actually serve practically as a benchmark or a guide for the way these products are managed. And we're going to start today with the review of these food regulatory framework, tackling food contact material. We're going to start with the first presentation on the regulatory frameworks in the United States and in the European Union. And this presentation is going to be given to us by Dr. Amin Assouf, who is a research scientist in the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, and will provide us with this overview. Amin, thank you very much for your contribution, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Samuel, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone. Let me share my screen. Okay, so hello, everyone. Let me first present myself. My name is Amin Assouf, and I am a research scientist at G-Force. I will be talking today about the different regulatory management approaches for food contact materials under the United States of America and the European Union frameworks. So my presentation will be mainly divided and will follow the following outline. I will start by an introduction. Then I will be briefing the United States of America food contact regulations, then the EU regulations on food contact materials, to finish with a brief conclusion on the topic. So, as Professor Dominic started by the introductory presentation on this topic, I would like to introduce my presentation by the terminology that is normally used in this field. In fact, based on the jurisdictions, we can find different terminologies used. Let's say we will be hearing of food contact articles, food contact materials, food packaging, food contact substances, food contact chemicals. So if we want to go in classifying those terminologies, let's say in a general way, and then based on the EU and the USA framework, we will be defining and we will be detailing the exact definitions. So normally a food contact article could be any food contact material coming into contact with food, going from packaging to cutlery to other food processing equipments. These food contact articles will mainly be formed by food contact materials like plastics, metals and alloys, paperboard, glass, varnishes, coating, adhesives, etc. And these food contact materials are constituted of food contact chemicals or substances like polymers, oligomers, some residual monomers, some intentionally added substances or additives, like in the case of plastics, pigments, other starting substances and production aids. And of course, as Professor Dominic stated and introduced, non-intentionally added substances, NIAS, like impurities or reaction and degradation products that can be found in the final product and present a huge hazard to food in contact. In fact, the production of food contact materials goes or starts with the producers of starting substances, then to the producers of food contact materials, to be used by food industries and eventually arrive to the consumers. Different international food regulatory jurisdictions have different regulatory measures governing contact between foodstuff and food contact materials, and stakeholders are required to comply with these all along the production chain. So these food contact regulatory measures or regulations are mainly or normally constituted first of some general requirements, then some lists, which are called positive lists of permitted substances to be used, with their corresponding limitations and restrictions, and in the case of EU and FDA, migration or extraction tests to be performed in order to prove the compliance of those food contact materials and the framework of those regulations. Let's start directly by the food contact materials legislation in the United States of America, which is handled by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. According to the US FDA, we can find the following definitions, starting by food contact substance, FCS, which is defined as any substance intended for use as a component of materials used in manufacturing, packing, packaging, transporting, or holding food, if such use is not intended to have a technical effect in the food itself. Then we can go for a higher level of definition, which is the food contact material, which is made with the food contact substance with other substances. It is often a mixture, such as the case of plastics, which are formed by the polymer with additives. And then we can go for the food contact articles, which are the finished packaging or the finished article. Now, according to the FDA, all relevant provisions for food contact materials are published in Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulation, Chapter 1, Subchapter B, Food for Human Consumption, under the following parts. The most interesting parts to be mentioned are the parts from 174 to 178 on indirect food additives. Now, why the title Indirect Food Additives? In fact, the precise requirements of the FDA are very material specific. The fundamental assumption is that all components of a material can migrate into food. So plastics, additives, and other food contact materials are thus considered as indirect food additives. Now, if we go back to the list of subparts or sections, we can classify them under three general types of regulations. First, those covering specific materials, examples 176 on paper and paperboard, 177 on polymers. And here we can find lists of permitted additives or substances, positive lists. Maximum levels of use were not covered by general lists. We can find specifications, such as density, melting points for polymers, let's say. And we can find some end test extractable limits, and sometimes even the test methods for these to be used. Now, another category of regulations, those covering substances to be used, like the 178 on antioxidant stabilizers for polymers. And here also we can find lists of permitted substances and maximum levels of use. And the third category of regulations are those listing substances used in specific types of packaging, like the 175 on adhesives, 177 on can coating. Now, let's start by the part 170.39, entitled Threshold of Regulation for Substances Used in Food Contact Articles. In fact, a substance used in a food contact article that migrates or that may be expected to migrate into food will be exempted from regulation as a food additive because it becomes a component of the food at a level or at levels that are below the threshold of regulation if, one, the substance has not been shown to be carcinogenic in humans or animals, and there is no reason based on the chemical structure of the substance to suspect that toxicity. The substance presents no other health or safety concern because the use is below a certain threshold of regulation. The substance has no technical effect in or on the food to which it migrates, and the substance use has no significant adverse impact on the environment. So in this case, food contact substances will be exempted from regulation as a food additive. They will be considered as indirect food additives. Now, if we directly go to the part 174, which encloses the general requirements for indirect food additives, we can see that the quantity of any food additive or any substance that may be added to food as a result of its use in articles that contact food shall not exceed any prescribed limitation as stated by the FDA regulation, and shall not be intended to accomplish any physical or technical effect in the food itself. In addition, any substance used as a component of articles that contact food shall be of a purity suitable for its intended use. It's like here we are re-mentioning the problem of NIAS, which can be impurities introduced with additives. Let's continue with the part 174, the general requirements for indirect food additives. Substances that under conditions of GMP may be safely used as component of articles or of food contact articles are substances generally recognized as safe in or on food, substances generally recognized as safe for their intended use in food packaging, substances used in accordance with a prior sanction or approval, substances which can be found in the positive lists of part 175 to 179, or substances with an effective pre-market notification, FCN, for food contact use. Let's take two examples for the FDA case, and then we can move for the EU framework. If we consider part 176, indirect food additives, paper and paperboard components, we can see that the subpart B of this part is consecrated to substances for use only as components of paper and paperboard components, and we can see a classification by substance. And we can have access to a very interesting and important paragraph, which is paragraph C, where we can find the list for food simulating solvents. We can find the time temperature conditions to be used for migration tests. Part 177 on polymers. Also, two interesting subparts, B and C. In subpart B, substances for use as basic components of single and repeated use food contact surfaces. Here we have a classification by resin type. Subpart C, also we have a classification by resin type, but also we have some classification by application, like the polymers to be used as filters and ultrafiltration and reverse osmosis membranes in textile or textile fibers, etc. So if we sum up these substance-oriented parts, let's say the part 176 on paper and paperboard components and 177 on polymers, we have a classification by substance for use only. It's a positive list. We have also classification by resin type, like polyethylene phthalate polymers, olefin polymers. And here we can find chemical definitions, monomers, copolymers. We can find permitted additives and production aids to be used with their corresponding limitations, use only as, let's say, or levels not to exceed. And also, what's also so interesting is that we can find migration tests, conditions, and in some instances, details related to analytical methodologies. If we reconsider this part 176.170, where we can find the test conditions to be applied for extraction with simulating solvents, we can find a very detailed classification of types of raw and processed food to be considered under 9 subcategories. If we take few examples, we have the non-acid aqueous products, we can have the acid aqueous products, the dairy products, low moisture beverages, dry solids, etc. So we have a classification of the food stuff to be considered in contact with food contact materials. And then we will have the conditions to be applied based on the type of food. Which food simulating solvent to be used, water, heptane, 8% alcohol, and under which temperature and time conditions in order to simulate the contact, the real contact between the packaging or the food contact material and the food itself. Also, as I mentioned, in a lot of instances under the FDA regulation, we can find specifications related to analytical methodologies to be applied, selection of extractability conditions. So we can see that in the FDA framework, they use a lot extraction test, extractability conditions, extractives. And we will see in the EU, we use a lot migration simulating solvents, simulants. So we can find also food simulating solvents, the selection of test methods, some equipments, procedures, how to select samples, how to determine the amount of extractives, and finally, to be able to compare to maximum permissible limits, let's say in milligram per square inch of food contact surface. Now, if we move to the EU framework regulation, first, let's start also by a definition. According to EU, a food contact material or materials are any materials or article intended to be brought into contact with food, like cutlery or kitchen equipments, are already in contact with food, like packaging, or can reasonably be brought into contact with food or transfer their constituents to the food under normal or foreseeable use. So this definition covers effectively everything. This potential contact may occur during food's production, processing, storage, preparation, before its eventual consumption by the consumer. The EU Food Contact Regulation Framework starts by a framework regulation, the very well-known EC 1935/2004, on materials and articles intended to come into contact with food. Then we can also find a general regulation on good manufacturing practices for materials and articles intended to come into contact with food. And here we can have two sets of regulations under the EU framework. Regulations on specific materials and regulation on specific substances. So I will take few examples. Regulations on specific materials, the very famous and well-known plastic regulation, EU 10/2011, with its amendments. We have a very interesting regulation, particularly nowadays, on recycled plastics. And in the case of specific substances, we have a regulation on bisphenol A, let's say, in varnishes and coating, and etc., on specific substances to be used in food contact materials. Now, if we take briefly the most important EU regulations on this topic, we have to start by the framework regulation. It is the primary European regulation or regulatory measure related to food contact materials. It applies to all food contact articles and materials. And it states requirements that should be fulfilled by any food contact materials, which are: one, the use of food contact material shouldn't endanger human health, shouldn't bring about unacceptable change in the composition of the food, and it shouldn't bring about a deterioration in the organoleptic characteristic of the food. Now, in the absence of European specific measures, Article 6 of this framework regulation urges member states to maintain and adopt national legislations. We have Articles 8 and 9 about the procedures for notifying new substances. Article 15 on labeling for food contact material and the very well-known food contact logo. Article 16, declaration of compliance, how to declare a compliance of a food contact material or packaging. And Article 17 about the traceability and its importance. Now, a GMP regulation, briefly, which states that any company that makes food contact materials must establish a quality assurance system and a quality control system, of course, with their corresponding documentation. A very interesting appendix or annex in this regulation, the Appendix 10, which speaks about printing inks, which are applied to the non-food contact side of materials and article, shall be formulated or applied or handled in such a manner that substances from the printed surface are not transferred to the food contact side, which is called the set-off effect. Of course, it should be avoided. The EU 10/2011, the very famous plastic regulation. So three main important titles. the union list of authorized substances or the positive list, migration tests to be applied overall and specific, and the conditions to declare the compliance of plastic food contact materials. So if we go quickly over all these titles, the first positive list, which is called the union list of authorized monomers and other starting substances, here we can find approximately 1,000 substances, macromolecules obtained from microbial fermentation, additives, production aids, stated by their CAS number, their EU reference number, etc., with their specifications, and the most importantly, their specific migration limits in case they exist. It's very clear in the EU framework that only substances listed in this union list may be used in the manufacturing of plastics. And this list is constantly amended by new molecules. Very importantly, in this regulation, we have the definition of overall migration limit, which is the total amount of non-volatile substances that can migrate from the material into food or food simulant. It's determined simply by gravimetric analysis. And the regulation states clearly that this overall migration cannot exceed 10 milligrams of total constituent released per square decimeter of FCM, or 60 milligrams of total constituent released per kilogram of food or food simulant. This overall migration limit applies equally to all plastic food contact materials, and it considers the EU cube model, which considers that 1 kilogram of food can be packed by 6 square decimeters of packaging material. Specific migration limits, which are now substance specific, plastic materials and articles shall not transfer their constituents to food or food simulants in quantities exceeding the SMLs in case they are clearly stated in the union list of authorized substances. We can notice that we have a lot of instances, a lot of cases where no specific migration limits are stated. So in this case, a generic specific migration limit or the generic specific migration limit of 60 milligram per kilogram of food shall apply, and EFSA is undergoing constant reassessment of all these substances in order to provide specific migration limits, or at least some classification under general families with general specific migration limits. Also, this regulation states the experimental conditions in order to apply migration tests, how to perform migration tests on plastic materials. So we have a list of food simulants in order to be used, or that can be used. So you noticed we employed the term food simulants frequently during this presentation. So these are solvents or mixture of solvents that can simulate the food in order to get rid of the complexity of the real food stuff when doing the analytical chemistry or applying the analytical chemistry methodology. So we have a list of food simulants. We have also correspondence between the food simulant and the food. Let's say here, if we take the example of beverages, non-alcoholic beverages or alcoholic beverages, we can see that the regulation states that food simulant B and C should be used. In case we have an asterisk, we can see that some correction factors should be applied, let's say, when using food simulant B or other kinds of food simulants. So as you can see, we have food simulants for acidic food stuff, for dry food stuff, for fatty hydrophobic food stuff, etc. Also, the regulation, as I mentioned, states the actual condition, test conditions, similarly to the FDA framework, to be applied. Let's say the actual use is, let's say, between 3 days and 30 days. We have to apply 10 days, let's say, for the test. The actual, let's say, the temperature used is between 20 degrees and 40 degrees, let's say room temperature conditions. We have to apply for our migration tests 40 degrees in order to simulate the worst case scenario. In the case of overall migration tests, also we have very clear specifications based on the EU regulation. Let's say what's interesting to be mentioned, any long-term storage at room temperature or below should be simulated by a test or an accelerated testing conditions for 10 days at 40 degrees. So in order to summarize and do a brief recap, what do you need to check and measure to prove the compliance of a plastic food contact materials with the EU regulation? You have to ensure that all your monomers and additives are listed either in the regulation 10/2011 or on the provisional positive list. You have to show compliance with overall migration limits, with specific migration limits in case they exist, or residual quantities defined as QAs or QAMs in the EU framework for monomers. And other additives. Here we have some experimental testing, as you noticed, to perform. Or you can show compliance, so finally, with specific migration limits for additives, either by calculations, by experimental testing, or by calculation of 100% migration, which is the worst case scenario, or by mathematical modeling, as Professor Dominic introduced in her presentation. And also, I should mention the problem of NIAS, non-intentionally added substances. So this EU 10/2011 states that as far as they are relevant for the risk assessment, these NIAS should be considered and included in the restrictions of the substance. And any potential health risk in the final material or article arising from these NIAS should be considered in accordance with internationally recognized principles on risk assessment. Some potential solutions are untargeted analytical approaches, which can combine fingerprinting with chemometrics in order to account for this problem. One word briefly about the recycled plastic regulation. So the 282/2008, we have a very interesting European framework for recycled plastic. This regulation states clearly the problematic, which is that plastic packaging waste may contain residues from previous use, contaminants from misuse, and contaminants from non-authorized substances. So it is necessary to lay down special requirements to ensure that materials and articles produced from recycled plastics and re-intended for food contact are compliant. It states also that recycled plastic used behind a plastic functional barrier are regarded as sufficiently safe. Certain types of materials and articles manufactured with recycled plastic may only be suitable for contact with specified types of food under certain conditions. And in Article 4, we can find the conditions for the authorization of a new recycling process to be handled by EFSA. As a conclusion, so we can see that just by presenting the major two frameworks or regulatory frameworks related to food contact materials, which are the FDA and EU, we can say that we have some disparities. We have a heterogeneous regulatory environment related to food contact materials. So we presented here some very explicit and detailed regulations. However, we can find that in other instances and other jurisdictions, we don't have regulations related to food contact materials, or they are still very brief on this topic. So this remains a challenging area to regulate, specifically for developing countries. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Assouf, for this overview. Indeed, in fact, these two regulatory frameworks tend to be cited as the benchmark frameworks that people attempt to refer to. And I think it's also important to note that these frameworks were not built overnight. They were actually built incrementally. But they are not the only ones, as you mentioned, Dr. Assouf, and we are going to be continuing our overview of other existing regulatory frameworks. And we're going to move now to Canada, and we have the privilege to welcome Dr. Mark Feely, who is the former Associate Director of Bureau of Chemical Safety at the Food Directorate within Health Canada. Health Canada being the standard setter for food safety and nutrition in Canada. And Mark will be providing us with an overview about the Canadian regulatory framework for these substances. Mark, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours. You don't mind unmuting yourself?
Yes. Can you hear me, Sandra?
I hear you.
Does everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
Is it possible, Samuel, for you to queue up my presentation?
Sure. In a second, Mark.
Thank you. All right. I guess we can start now. As Professor Godefroy had mentioned, I will be providing a brief overview of the current regulatory management approach for food packaging materials or food contact materials currently in Canada. Canada, I would say, sort of has a bit of a hybrid approach, as was explained for the FDA and the EU, whereas it develops both prohibitions for the use of specific packaging materials, but also attempts to provide positive lists and guidance to food contact industry members in terms of the manufacture and use of their food packaging material in Canada. So it's because of this hybrid approach, it's not totally aligned with FDA, even though we share quite a bit of commerce between the two. So in the outline of this presentation, we'll provide an introduction in terms of what type of data is required by Health Canada in terms of making an opinion about the acceptability of their packaging material. And this includes providing information about the chemical identity of the packaging material and potential uses. There's migration data that's expected from the use of packaging material. This migration data, as has been previously described, is typically used to develop some estimated exposure for the consumer. And then finally, last but not least, there is toxicology data requirements that are combined with the exposure data in terms of developing acceptability. So next slide. So it's quite interesting because Health Canada typically in its release of information that it provides for manufacturers indicate it's the responsibility of the food industry to ensure that their products comply with Canada's food standards and regulatory requirements. So essentially what Health Canada is saying is that, you know, we will provide you guidance in terms of determining the acceptability of your food packaging material, but ultimately you will be responsible for ensuring its safety and that your product meets these regulatory requirements. In Canada, there's a single overarching Food and Drug Act, and this simply provides the basis for the regulation of all products associated with basically health and safety. And this basically applies to products that are not only produced and sold in Canada, but also imported in Canada. So the Food and Drug Act simply indicates what the health and safety provisions are for food products, but this also extends to drugs, therapeutic products, medical devices, anything related to health in Canada is defined under the Canadian Food and Drug Act. So in this particular case, the Food and Drug Act being the overarching food regulation for health and safety is supported by specific regulations that are developed under the Food and Drug Regulations. So these are basically the regulations were developed for carrying out the purposes and the provisions of the Act and ensuring that they are into effect. So, and in the Food and Drug Regulations, it will specify specific issues related to food packaging use and how they may be applied to determine the health and safety of the product in question. And lastly, but not leastly, as it's sort of indicated by the bottom of the slide, there is a criminal element, and this is quite common to regulations involving safety of health products, but whether they be food or drugs or medical devices. In this case, for food, a violation of the Food and Drug Acts or regulations specific to the provisions currently would result in penalties. If there was a deliberate adulteration of a food product through food packaging, that would be up to 3 years in prison and a $250,000 fine. So, as I mentioned, the first overarching act is the Food and Drug Acts, and there's the URL associated with it. And basically, it has the umbrella provision that no person shall sell an article of food that has in it or on it any poisonous or harmful substance. So this has, after they develop this this general provision, it basically means that a manufacturer or a seller of a food product is responsible for ensuring that the food does not have any poisonous or harmful substances. So this is a relatively overarching provision, and the Food and Drug Acts actually goes back quite a while. I mean, it was initially developed back in the late 1800s and came into fruition in the early 1900s, around 1919. So at that time, it wasn't considered that pesticides or vet drugs or et cetera, which can be poisonous or harmful substances, would be deliberately added to food. So there are specific provisions of the Food and Drug Acts that exempt food if the substance is being added for a deliberate purpose. And that particular substance, if it has poisonous or harmful properties, is exempted if it complies with a maximum level or a maximum residue level. So specifically, in order to for food packaging to comply with this general provision that no person shall sell an article of food that has in it any poisonous or harmful substances, there's a specific division of the Food and Drug Regulations, Division 23, which is specific to packaging materials. And essentially, it provides another umbrella statement that basically means that you cannot package a food in a material if that material has the potential to transfer any substance which might be poisonous or harmful, in this case, injurious to the health of the consumer. So this next slide basically this provides a general introduction to what the current packaging material situation is, and this is in North America. So this is the type of packaging that's currently in use. You'll see minor differences in the EU and other areas of the world, but specifically this is what you tend to see in North America, so the US and Canada. The type of food that is packaged in Canada is represented by this pie diagram. And specifically, that information is used in developing the exposure assessment estimations. So how much of the particular packaging material is used with food and how much of that food is being consumed. So in this particular case, there is guidance provided to industry, essentially a guidance document, and the URL is being provided here, where industry can review and submit the necessary data for Health Canada to conduct a pre-market assessment of their chemical safety. So essentially, this information requirement for food packaging submissions, when fulfilled, basically will meet the obligations as defined under Section 4 of the Food and Drug Act and Division 23 of the Food and Drug Regulations. So if all the information is provided, it's considered to be acceptable following a review by Health Canada, then the conditions of the Food and Drug Act and Food and Drug Regulations will have been met. So any and all information submitted to Health Canada is considered to be confidential business information. So Health Canada will not share without the explicit consent of the submitter, nor will they acknowledge the existence of a submission until it's been completed. In general, what you find is that manufacturers will have to submit information about the product identity that they're using for food packaging materials, and this includes any trade name, grade of packaging material, the composition, the quantitative listings of all the ingredients in the packaging material. And that not only includes if we're dealing with plastics, the polymer, but also any materials that have gone into developing and forming the polymer, and any additional chemicals that have been added to a polymer for specific purposes. In general, also, there's a requirement that the form of the finished product be described in terms of whether it's a film, whether it's a bottle, etc. Dimensions of the packaging, thickness and volume, types of food involved, the condition of use, storage conditions, the time and temperature, the weight of the food per unit area of packaging, which has been previously described. And more importantly, the results of any migration data or extraction data that are available in order to fulfill the toxicological data requirements that might be essentially required for that particular chemical. So, as Professor Godfrey had mentioned, what we're seeing is that there's been an evolution, and this has been something that the regulatory regimes have had to keep up with. Typically, when you're talking about non-intentionally added substances, as previously mentioned, or NIAS, these were specific to monomers or oligomers that were involved in the production of the plastic material, but also specific requirements where these specific chemicals are being added only for the purpose of the packaging material itself, either to prolong its longevity or to add to its resiliency or some other factor in terms of possibly increasing the stability or usefulness of the packaging material. However, now what we're seeing, and this is part of what the evolution of food packaging materials is coming about. And if we go to the next slide, you're seeing that I think the food packaging industry is starting to skirt the rules of non-intentionally added substances, where you have specifically chemicals that are being added to packaging materials that are acting as antioxidants for the food that's being packaged. So what you're seeing is more of an intentional addition of active agents to food packaging that are having a specific effect on the food that's being packaged. So, more specifically, what you're seeing is metals being packaged in food that has, or in packaging material that has added antimicrobials, which, with the knowledge that that packaging material is going to add some antimicrobial activity to the food itself. In addition, there's foods that have a high fat content. You find they're being packaged in packaging that has antioxidants, which stabilizes the fat content and prolongs the shelf life. So we're going from an area where you're looking at specifically not intentionally added substances that are migrating, and these are associated just with the manufacturing of the packaging material, to actual chemicals that are being added specifically for interaction with the food and how to assess the migration of those. So one example I'd like to mention, and this is reflected in the Food and Drug Regulations, is that very early on, one of the first packaging materials that was developed as a replacement for glass was polyvinyl chloride. So, and I think this, the example of polyvinyl chloride really brought to the forefront the issue that chemicals from packaging material could migrate into food. Subsequent to the approval and the use of polyvinyl chloride, what was being detected in food was vinyl chloride, which is a monomeric component of PVC. So this chemical was found to migrate into food, and at the same time, the chemical was being identified as a potential human carcinogen. So generally, you'll find that the majority of regulatory agencies, in this case, will develop strict limits or derogations that will not allow the use of polyvinyl chloride if vinyl chloride is being detected as a migrant in food. And certainly this is reflected in the Division 23 of the Food and Drug Regulations, where there is a prohibition to using any PVC as a packaging material in Canada if it has detectable vinyl chloride as a migrant. So in this particular slide, what we're essentially looking at, this is a chromatogram. The x-axis is the time, so it's the minutes of the elution. The y-axis is simply the millivolts, or the detection of the signal. So what we've done here is we've used some sort of simulant in a variety of packaging material. There are specific requirements set up for migration conditions with specific simulants. Then you look at an analysis of these particular chemicals to detect the type and concentration estimate that can migrate. And the migration conditions are all set up as being relatively standard. So, and as previously mentioned, there are acceptable migrants that you can provide as coming from simulants. And these simulants are usually easier to use than actually applying the food under real life conditions, where you're actually putting the food in the packaging material and analyzing the food. What's acceptable to the majority of regulatory agencies is that you use a simulant that is designed to show the interaction between the potential packaging material and the physical chemical properties of the food itself. And typically these are things such as acetic acid and ethanol and distilled water. And in most cases, what you find is that the type of food proposed for use of the packaging material will define the type of simulant that's used in the migration. So to provide a reasonable intake estimation that can result from the use of this packaging material, essentially you have to look at the concentration of the extracted material, and this could be in an aqueous, an acidic, or a fat, or an alcoholic type of food. And then once again, look at the fraction of the total diet of that particular food that's likely to be in the packaging material. The fraction of the type of packaging material which is likely to contain the constituent, the market penetration of that particular packaging material use. And this is defined generally by surveys of the packaging industry. If you recall, the previous slide had the pie diagram, and this would be used in terms of defining what the probable daily intake of any particular migrant that's detected, as shown in that chromatogram from the previous slide. So it all goes in stages of providing the appropriate migrant to act as a simulant, detection of that migrant as a potential migrating substance, the concentration of that migrant, the identification generally through standard libraries that are used, and then the estimation of the probable daily intake, or the estimated daily intake that can result from the use of that packaging material. So this, in general, what you see is that there are huge orders of magnitude of potential daily intakes. In a lot of cases, these will become theoretical estimations based on the amount of potential migrant that's in the packaging material, the conditions of use, and the physical chemical properties of that migrant. So what we haven't sort of discussed on the previous slide is that there are specific conditions required for recycled plastics that we won't discuss here, but in general, additional migration studies have to be performed with spiking materials that are estimated to produce sort of a worst case scenario of recycled plastic uses. So this particular slide simply something that Health Canada has produced, and up until about 2012, they had assessed approximately 500 different chemicals from packaging material submissions. And as I mentioned, there's a huge difference in potential migration of chemicals, which would result in exposure estimations all the way from femtogram per kilogram body weight per day up to milligram per kilogram body weight per day. So by the time you get up to milligram quantities of a chemical in food, you're almost seeing intake estimations that are approximate to food additives. And this is, I think, belays the previous point that was made about, there are specific active materials that are being added to packaging material, which are, possibly deliberately meant to have migration because they are having a functional effect on the stability of the food and extending the shelf life of the food. So, and then I think it really comes down to the crux of the issue. You have detected all of these potential migrants from the use of packaging materials, so chemicals that are in the food packaging that could possibly migrate to food and result in exposure from consumption of that food. How do you assess the safety in order to comply with the Food and Drug regulations that no packaging material should impart to the food a chemical that's, or a substance that's injurious to the health of the consumer? So there are definitely background documents that can be provided on this, but essentially the majority of regulatory decisions are made based on a threshold of regulation, or in other words, it's also referred to as a threshold of toxicological concern. So this is something that it's an idea that was initially proposed back in 1967, in that the toxic properties of a chemical are directly related to its structure. So initially, there was a large number of chemicals defined, almost 500, where there was a full toxicology data requirement. These could be subdivided into categories based on structural activity. And essentially, the idea is that you could define a concentration or exposure to which any potential toxicological harm has been minimized or is considered to be tolerated. And in this particular case, Health Canada relies on a threshold of regulation of 0.025 microgram per kilogram body weight per day as an intake, or 25 nanogram per kilogram body weight per day. So essentially, any migrant from the previous testing that is less than 0.5 parts per billion would result in a potential exposure of less than 0.025 microgram per kilogram body weight per day. And therefore, the petitioner could indicate that based on the threshold of regulation or threshold of toxicological concern, there is no toxicity testing requirements. So Health Canada initially developed its threshold of regulation based on a previous Red Book position that was published by the FDA, and it provides a very detailed assessment or summary of how this threshold of regulation has been developed. And this threshold of toxicological concern or threshold of regulation is continually undergoing refinement, and this refinement is being provided both by the European Food Safety Authority and the Joint Expert Committee of Food Additives, in part by World Health Organization, the Food and Agriculture Organization, because the same threshold of toxicological concern or threshold of regulation is currently in use for approval of flavoring agents that are being added to food. They use the same structural activity to toxicity approach. So you'll find that in future derivations of this approach, they have developed positions specific to chemicals that are potential carcinogens. So overall, if at the end of if all the information has been submitted to Health Canada with the estimated potential daily intakes and the required toxicology data is sufficient, Health Canada will issue something known as a letter of no objection. And simply, it's the department's way of saying you have fulfilled the requirements of the Food and Drug Act and Division 23 of the regulations, and we have no objection to the use of this particular packaging material. These low-nos have no expiry as long as their conditions of use do not change. So the chemical constituent of the packaging material and the conditions of use don't change. So the low-no is basically has no expiry date. So following the issue of that low-no, a manufacturer of a packaging material can go to food industry and say, Health Canada has provided me the basis to legally market this food packaging material. So, and what was convenient is that up until 2014, every food packaging material, including every chemical added to food packaging material, was added to a searchable database. And this is the reference listing for acceptable construction materials, packaging materials, and non-food chemical products database. And the URL has been provided there. So up until 2014, all the information from a letter of no objection was added to this database. So a potential client who wanted to purchase a packaging material for specific use, whether it be a film, a bottle, a container, whatever, could go to this database and see these are all the companies that have been provided the legal requirement to market their product in Canada, and I can accept that. There's, and this, once again, the evolution of the regulation of food packaging materials. Currently, the industry, there's been a bit of a loosening of the requirements, and that an industry representative can simply provide a letter of guarantee indicating it's sort of a self-attestation that they have information to show that the packaging material that they are attempting to market meets all the requirements of the food and drug regulations. So once again, this goes back to the initial tenet that the food industry is legally responsible for ensuring that their food packaging material has meet the requirements of the Food and Drug Act and the Food and Drug regulations. So in addition to the reference list for all materials that can be used in food packaging material, Health Canada also provides a list of acceptable polymers. So, and these polymers are broken down to every single polymeric site. And so if you are attempting to market a particular packaging material, you can look at the list of acceptable polymers. If your polymer comes up on that list, you can then look at the list of acceptable packaging materials and non-food chemicals to see whether that can be added to the particular polymer. So I would consider the current regulatory environment in Canada more to be sort of a hybrid approach where there is a defined regulatory element that specifies you have to show your packaging material is safe for use. Guidelines are provided to industry in order to develop the information, and which can be submitted free of charge to Health Canada for an assessment of the approval of your packaging material. And once again, thank you very much for the invitation and allowing me to provide a brief overview of the current situation in Canada for food packaging material use and approval.
We had a number of references that were available. So I'd like to reassure our viewers and our participants that we will be making these slides available on the website of the Global Food Regulatory Science Society.
I already put it in the chat box, the link where the information will be made available. And I will make sure essentially that they are available as of at the end of this event. Now, I know that we are beyond the time, and thank you for sticking with us. For those of you who continue to be part of this webinar, we're going to move now to another regulatory framework, and we are privileged to have with us Dr. Scott Crerar, who is General Manager of Standards at the Binational Authority of Food Standards Australia and New Zealand. Scott joins us from Australia, so it's been really very late for you or very early, Scott. So thank you again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sam. And hello, everyone. Yes, it's very early here on Wednesday morning in Australia after 1:30 a.m. So please excuse me if I fade a little. So I want to take a little bit of a different approach to the previous speakers, but thank them for all setting the scene in terms of what regulations are out there across the world. And that sort of, as I said, it sort of gives us a good base for what I'm going to say. I want to have a look at a review that we did across our standards in Australia and New Zealand for food packaging chemicals, and by doing this illustrate the regulations that we have in place, but the rationale for the system that we actually have. So my outline today is just a quick look at Food Standards Australia and New Zealand, and the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code, because the code provides the basis of requirements for substances added to food across Australia and New Zealand. Look at the requirements around food packaging chemicals that may migrate into food. Some of the surveys and risk assessment work that we did to support this review around food packaging chemicals and the risk management approach that we actually adopted. FSANZ is an Australian statutory agency within the health portfolio, but it does set standards across both Australia and New Zealand for certain areas. But of course, one of those areas is substances that can be added to food. So that is one area, and I'll explain that in a little bit more detail. The main function of FSANZ is to develop and administer the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code, and it is a legislative instrument that is given effect by state and territory and New Zealand laws. So FSANZ itself has no responsibility for enforcement. That lies with the states and territories, or if you're in Canada, provinces, and they also have their own food acts, which are quite harmonised across those states and territories that essentially give them the power of enforcement. So the Australian New Zealand Food Standards Code is split up into what we call chapters. And if we're talking about substances, all sorts of substances or requirements for particular things in foods, a la limits, whether they be additives, food processing aids, contaminants, microbiological. It's in chapter 1, and we call that vertical standard across all foods. We have chapter 2 that that has specific standards for particular foods. And then we have other chapters that deal with more of food safety practices and standards at the primary production level. Now, chapters 1 and 2 apply to both Australia and New Zealand. So that's one of the aspects I wanted to point out. And certainly in this area of chemicals and contaminants that may arise from food packaging, that's the code covers both Australia and New Zealand. So if we're looking at chemicals migrating from food packaging, I suppose the risk management approaches that we may have, firstly, and we've seen that across the US, EU and Canada that there are various levels established for contaminants. Also, you know, there are migration levels from particular packaging materials. Now, I want to point out that FSANZ only can establish levels in the food. We don't govern packaging materials per se. Other agencies are involved in that. So yeah, that is not our role. So we would be only looking at levels in the actual food. And I think it's also important to point out that we really only look at a maximum level where it serves an effective risk management function and a significant contribution to the total dietary exposure. For that reason, and where there is a public health, risk of that substance if over a particular level. And for that reason, we only traditionally had very few mLs in Food Standards Code relating to chemicals arising from food packaging. It's also important to note that within Food Acts across Australia, there are general and quite strong provisions that all food must be safe and suitable. And it is, as Mark mentioned, across Canada as well, it is the responsibility of industry to ensure the safety of their foods at all levels. As I said, there is the alternative to establish mLs for packaging material and not the food, but that's not under FSANZ's purview. I think importantly, it's also, we have to look at, I suppose, regulation across a broad lens. We're not just talking about standards and limits. We're talking about other measures in terms of information, codes of practice. Mark talked about guidance as well in Canada, and also self-regulation by industry through their standards and also their quality assurance processes. So it's this holistic look at what we had in place across Australia and New Zealand that we wanted to learn more about and to determine whether we needed to actually establish more standards along the lines of the EU and the US, or whether the system is actually operating cohesively and there are sufficient controls and assurances in place. Some of the few standards that are in the Food Standards Code, and Mark mentioned the issue of polyvinyl chloride and the migration of vinyl chloride, probable human carcinogen, but also acrylonitrile that can be found in a range of plastics. There are limits there. Those limits are set at the limit of detection. And traditionally, we also had limits for tin from canned foods, which have shown to have public health effects over the years. So there's maximum levels there. I think what we also heard from Dr. Domenech early on is the big challenge around food packaging chemicals. Firstly, from a risk assessment point of view, the multitude of chemicals, I suppose the expansion of the use, and Mark talked about new uses of particular substances in food packaging. So the expansion of the use of I suppose, known chemicals, but also chemicals with unknown properties and not always having a good understanding of their toxicology. And obviously we have that complexity of there being so many food packaging materials, chemicals used across, many facets of the industry, production, bulk packaging, adhesives, etc., printing inks. So very complex, as was pointed out early on. And how do we assess the risk that may arise from such, a multitude of chemicals, firstly for which we may know some properties and toxicology, but then the unknown. So it's certainly a challenge. And the question we wanted to really ask was, are the current risk management measures managing the risk? We did know, we had been lobbied for quite some years from some parts of the industry that perhaps the smaller end of industry wasn't managing the risks of food packaging chemicals well. We also heard from Dr. Domenech around the challenges of recycled materials, contamination, and also what was the knowledge of industry as a whole around chemicals migrating from packaging, and therefore what were their risk management practices. So the big questions we were asking was, what was the potential public health and safety risk arising from food packaging? What were the risk management measures in place? And as I explained, not only just the mandatory standards, but right across industry in terms of all the assurances that were in place. And were these regulations and practices adequate? So was there, I suppose, residual risk in the system? This was the ultimate question we were asking. And did we have to put in place further measures to address that potential residual risk? So there were various activities undertaken, and there's a lot actually in this slide in terms of work, and this was undertaken over a number of years, this project and the review of standards and risk management for food packaging chemicals. We had an industry advisory group. There were various levels of consultation. There are a range of surveys undertaken with industry in terms of their practices, questionnaires put to various levels of industry, both small and large, to glean what their practices were and their knowledge of this area was. We undertook surveys of our own in terms of food packaging chemicals, and obviously we looked at overseas requirements in terms of regulations. So for some chemicals, we looked at that we had traditionally seen when we undertook surveys. You can do the classical, risk assessment where you have got a good database and you may have health-based guidance values, and you can actually characterise that risk. From our surveys, we had some indication of the likely exposure assessment in terms of the combination of the concentration data, food consumption data that we have in our databases, and therefore we could estimate the dietary exposure and compare that to health-based guidance values. So that was done with key chemicals that I'll touch upon also in a minute or two. I suppose you do have to have your data on consumption of specific foods and the level of the chemicals in those foods when you're undertaking your exposure assessments. We heard earlier that it can be difficult to get an estimate of dietary assessments. I suppose our assumptions were that migration levels are usually low. We tend to use screening approaches based on worst case exposure scenarios to get an indication of risk characterisation initially. And that involves using maximum detected concentration when there are non-detects as well. So that gives you a very conservative approach to dietary exposure. But of course, if that's not adequate and if it indicates a potential problem, then there's refinement that can be done with the dietary exposure assessment, further testing and refining the dietary exposure assessment. Mark also talked about the technique of threshold of toxicological concern, looking at establishing human exposure threshold values for groups of chemicals. So looking at chemical structures and the known toxicity of chemicals which share those similar structural characteristics. And so you can allocate various thresholds depending on those structure and functional groups. And we did some of this work as well. We obviously leant heavily on the work of the US and the Europeans. We didn't reinvent the wheel here, but we utilised the approaches that, as Mark said, have been utilised through JECFA and EFSA and also the US to look at some of the groups of chemicals in a range of packaging. So some of the surveys that we utilise for our work in this review are shown here across Australia and New Zealand. We had some early survey work done on bisphenol A, where there obviously were detections. You'd be worried if you didn't get detections, but no safety concerns based on risk assessment. We also looked at phthalates and perfluorinated compounds and a range of other chemicals in a range of packaged materials such as glass, paper, plastic, and cans. Did not see safety concerns there. Later on, through our total diet survey work, we looked again at a range of chemicals, including phthalates and printing ink chemicals. Saw some potential issue with the phthalates and undertook to undertake some more survey work there, additional foods, additional concentration work, and later showed through that additional work that there probably weren't concerns. This was followed up in 2018. New Zealand also undertook some work in 2017. 2018, we also looked at mineral oil hydrocarbons and concluded that there were no safety concerns. So the conclusion of this work around food contact materials were, from the Australian-New Zealand perspective, certainly, was that probably exposures from food packaging were low and unlikely to pose new public health and safety concerns. We did see from the industry, from an overall perspective, there were a lot of control measures in place. And for example, a lot of the large industry that were manufacturing packaging in Australia and the large importers that were bringing packaging materials into Australia were complying with predominantly EU regulations anyway. And they also had quality assurance processes around their production and processing equivalent to what was described for the EU. Our analytical surveys of targeted chemicals did not show a risk. The area of concern was the small to medium enterprises that showed not as a good knowledge of the issue as the larger industries, which in many ways you'd come to expect. But the bottom line in terms of action here was that the review concluded that there was no need to set more specific limits at this stage, but there was a need to look at greater guidance and information for industry on the safety issues around food packaging, and to clearly describe the obligation on food businesses to use safe packaging materials and to source safe packaging materials. So I'm going to end there. Thank you, Sam.
In Australia, Scott. So I believe now we have reached, in fact, the end, at least, of the presentations as they were planned. And as mentioned, we are a little bit behind schedule. Nonetheless, we will offer actually the opportunity for some questions and answers, if at all possible, to our participants. We have a few participants that are still with us. There were, in fact, a number of questions that were posed, but we attempted to address them through the written answers of the webinar series. So I believe that there was at least one hand raised. Penny Campbell. Penny, if you will please pose your question or add your comment.
Sorry, I didn't have a question or a comment. I'm not sure what has happened.
No, you had simply your hand raised, so we just wanted to double check that you did not want to intervene by a question or a comment.
My apologies.
Okay, not a problem then. Any other colleagues who may have a question or an intervention? Just actually screening through the room. And perhaps also I would like maybe to give the floor to our panelists. I know that Dr. Dominic, Dr.
Healy, and other colleagues basically offered some comments and some responses to our participants. If any of you would like to follow up, please, you may take the floor.
If I may, as I understood that there was a discussion in the chat about the real use of the plastics and why the plastics don't have a shelf life in themselves. Is this right when I summarize this like this? So I might say to it that in any case, it is always the food which needs to be protected. So the plastics shelf life needs to be superior of the one of the food. There is now in Europe a specific change in that because of the recycled materials and the functional barriers. But normally here plastics are going to be assessed in a use situation, which is like a worst case. And then the plastic is safe in a foreseeable use of the container. But the panelists or the discussion was right. There may be non-assessed situations, like when people are doing something very else with the plastic container they were buying. I don't know, they are buying a bottle and then they're putting some pesticides inside and then they're cleaning it and then they're drinking out of the pesticide bottle. So these are non-assessed situations, and then we cannot guarantee for safety anymore. And the other non-assessed situations is when you are using all your kitchen things for kitchen utensils, and when you're losing them very much over time, this might also be problematic for safety in some point, because the aging of the plastics is not very well assessed. This was, I think, my last line in the conclusions, that safety assessment today is only done on new plastics and new containers, because most of the plastic packaging are intended on single use. And when you intend it on single use, you have a small service time, and that's why you're assessing the new containers. Aging is definitely something which needs to be worked on now. And well, the thing where there is a change is for the functional barriers in Europe for the recycled plastics, because as I was explaining, and the others were explaining also, especially Dr. Serrar, when you have the recycled plastics, you have a lot of contaminants which are coming with your plastic. And one of the means you have to manage this is to put a virgin plastic layer between the food and your recycled plastic. And this is going then to be a barrier for some time. So you need to design this functional barrier in a manner that the migration of the molecules is in any kind slower, and it is not effective to its maximum during the shelf life of the product. But in that case, you are going to decrease maybe the shelf life of the product, because the functional barrier is only going to last for some time. This is a situation we have now in Europe, where, but then what you are going to see as a customer, you're just going to have a best before date, which is smaller, which is less long in time as you had it before. But this is also a situation you can already find in several food containers. For example, plastic packed fruit juices have a slower shelf life as compared to fruit juices which are packed in glass bottles. So this is not a very big change in the habits for the consumers.
Okay. Apologies, colleagues.
We are just managing a few technical issues. So thank you very much, Dr. Domenech, actually, for this great addition. So definitely you've highlighted a number of challenges that we continue to face, and
definitely the issues of assessing the multiple uses, issues related to off-label use or use beyond essentially the intended purpose of a particular product. And also you've highlighted the issues about recycled materials, which hopefully will be a subject of discussion during our upcoming session on the 24th of February. I believe actually we have reached the end of this session. I'm just going to be doing a very quick wrap up, in fact, of our session here. So again, we're trying to manage with the technologies that sometimes does not cooperate very well. So really an attempt to wrap up. First of all, the fact that there are a number of framework that are available that could be used really for guidance purposes as it relates to the regulation of these substances, the regulation of these materials when they are used in conjunction with food production. Most of the frameworks rely on a general set of requirements related to the suitability of the product, even actually conditions of testing and assessment of these products. Some of the framework may rely on negative lists, so essentially substances or conditions that may not be acceptable Others actually also rely on positive lists, and these positive lists actually also rely on notification or application. So essentially, there is an element of a pre-market oversight, a pre-market review. And this makes, again, this regulatory framework to be evolutionary in nature, so not necessarily static. And it poses really a challenge for a number of jurisdictions, particularly in developing countries, as to the way they may consider addressing the regulation of these products. Perhaps this could be a topic of further discussion that we may organize at an upcoming session. Now, once again, I would like to ask you to join me in thanking all our speakers and our panelists for this event. Big thanks to all the participants that essentially still are with us. We've reached, I think, a number that exceeded 180 participants at a point in time, and we still have 100 participants with us. I would like to invite you to join us again for the second part of this webinar series dedicated to food contact materials, which will be focusing on recycling materials, recycled materials and conditions of assessment and management. That's going to be held on the 24th of February, going to be brought to you from Dubai to the rest of the world, and it's going to be held at 2 p.m. GMT or UTC +1. So that's essentially Paris time, if you wish, for those of you who would like to have a reference. Thank you very much again, and see you on Thursday. All the best.
Bye all.
Thank you, Samuel. Bye, everybody.
See you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Welcome to the first Capacity Building Event 2022 on the Food Contact Materials International Regulatory Framework and Food Contact Materials Recycling Regulations and Guidance. This event is organized by the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, G-Force. Welcome to the first Capacity Building Event 2022 on the Food Contact Materials International Regulatory Framework and Food Contact Materials Recycling Regulations and Guidance. This event is organized by the Global Food Regulatory Science Society, G-Force.